Welcome, everyone. Right now, we have our next speaker is up. So this is second of 3 container talks. So you might still need a patch for your jeans, but you no longer need a patch for prod. So take it away.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name is Dan. I'm an engineer on Google Cloud. I work on a whole bunch of open source tools related to container security. Like I said, almost all of this is open source. So you can find me on GitHub in Kubernetes, the Minikube project, and then other things like Canico, Scaffold, and Critis.
And I'm Maya Kaczorowski. I'm a product manager in security at Google, and I work on container security.
So before we get started, I want to ask the audience a few questions just to gauge familiarity. Could everybody here put their hands up if they are using containers in production? Wow. All right, has anybody here heard of or tried out Kubernetes?
Again, most of the audience, cool.
Yeah, awesome. Now keep your hand up if you're using it in production.
Half of that, maybe.
Quite a few went down, yeah, cool. All right, so thanks everybody for coming. In this talk, we're gonna cover what containers and Kubernetes are, because you've heard of them, but about half of you have actually used them in production. But this talk is not about how to secure Kubernetes. There are a bunch of talks specific to that at other conferences. Instead, we're gonna take a step back from Kubernetes itself and talk about some of the implementation details like containers and how they affect security more generally. We're gonna talk about software supply chains and how containers affect that. We'll describe what they are and then what changes you have to make to them when you move to containers. We also have a pretty exciting demo halfway through to show how all of this works, both with software and with these jean jackets. And then maybe by the end, you'll believe us when we say that moving to microservices and containers can actually help improve your software supply chain strategy. So first of all, containers, Kubernetes, and how that changes the model for security. Containers are all the rage these days, but what is a container? The common definition is that it's a packaging tool in the Linux kernel comprised of 2 primitives called namespaces and cgroups. But unless you're a kernel expert, that probably doesn't help very much. In this case, the physical metaphor, the word container, really does make a difference. Shipping containers and the whole shipping container supply chain revolution is built up on the idea of standardizing the format in which we ship physical goods. Putting all these into containers that are the exact same size and shape allows supply chains to move goods around the world a lot more efficiently. And that's what containers are for software as well. Containers standardize a format for packaging your code as well as all the system level dependencies into a single unit that can be shipped and deployed and run anywhere that implements that container contract. There are a lot of parallels between containers and virtual machines, but the main difference is around resource isolation. Virtual machines provide isolation at the hardware level, whereas containers require you to run everything all on the same host and the same kernel. Containers have a lot less isolation in this sense, but they provide for a lot better resource efficiency. The support for containers was merged into the Linux kernel sometime around 2004, but they didn't really take off until recently when Docker exploded in popularity. Docker provided a single tool chain for building, testing, and running them simply. There was batteries included, and that was installable on a wide range of Linux distributions. Many people here have already tried out Kubernetes and are using it in production, so we won't get too far into that. But Kubernetes provides a set of primitives for running containers across a cluster of machines. Those could be VMs or physical machines. It defines a set of primitives for running, scaling, monitoring, logging, and doing all the things you need to do for production with containers. Containers provide the magic of encapsulating your application and all of its dependencies into a single unit, and then Kubernetes lets you run that across a large cluster.
From a security point of view, looking back at the year in threats, we haven't actually seen that many active attacks on containers in the wild. It seems that the industry is still just kind of figuring out what these things are, and likewise, attackers are also figuring out what these things are and how to best exploit containers in Kubernetes. So in February of last year, 2018, Tesla made the news for attackers finding and accessing their Kubernetes dashboard and using cloud credentials that they gained there to mine cryptocurrency. This was really similar to an attack that happened on Aviva in late 2017. In May, Shopify had a researcher report a vulnerability in their cluster configuration. This was thankfully not exploited. In June, Weight Watchers had the exact same issue that Tesla had with an unsecured dashboard. This was also discovered by a researcher and not exploited. And the same month, several container images were found on Docker Hub that had embedded malware for mining cryptocurrency. What's happened more recently? Well, we don't even really know about that yet. Maybe the NSA does. What's really interesting about all these attacks that you'll see is that none of them explicitly attack containers or containerized workloads.
Application dashboards being left exposed has been a problem since at least the 80s.
Some of these do attack misconfigurations though in Kubernetes, but the end goal isn't even the application that you're running in Kubernetes, it's just the compute, right? That's not how attackers make money. They want cryptocurrency mining, they want botnets, they don't care about the fact that you're running Kubernetes. And so I hear security people complain about containers in Kubernetes all day long. In fact, that's kind of my day job. Some of the typical issues I hear are first, a lack of understanding. They don't know what containers in Kubernetes are and are afraid to learn. Now you know a little bit, so maybe this is less of a concern. After all, it's just more shit for you to secure, right? Frustration with existing tooling is next, since we're already dealing with an industry, that's still relatively new and where adoption is still rising, there aren't necessarily the same security tools that you're used to. So the idea of an IDS or an application layer firewall for Kubernetes are not really real yet. So if you're walking around the RSA Expo floor and someone's trying to sell you that, you're really falling for the snake oil right now. Next up, a common concern is container escapes. A lot of security professionals are worried about using containers for this particular reason. It's if we're running a multi-tenant environment and one workload can escape its container and affect another workload in the same environment. However, the impact of a container escape can be quite high. However, we haven't seen many vulns like this in the wild, and it's not really a surprise that containers aren't really good at containing from a security point of view, right? That wasn't the original intent. So you do see projects now coming out like gvisor, Kata containers, and Firecracker that are supposed to try to address this explicitly. Lastly, and you have come to realize with these issues, it just doesn't matter in some sense, right? A lot of people I talk to, it's their boss's boss wants to use containers. The dev team is going to start doing Kubernetes, and now it's your job as security people to secure it. You don't have a choice. So you've gone through the 5 stages of grief, and that's where most of the conversations I have are, which is, I have to use this thing, help me secure it, please help me, and please help me make the best of the situation. So there's ongoing work in all of these areas, better education and awareness, tooling, isolation, et cetera, but that's not so much that last piece. So today we're going to try to convince you that when your dev team says, hey, we've been playing with Kubernetes, you should actually be excited about that, because that means you get to have a lot better security in a lot of different ways. In a way that was just never possible with your previous infrastructure. A lot of what's needed to protect containers are constructs that we're already familiar with, right? You still are going to want things that look like firewalls, access management, audit logging, IDS, IPS, and more. Here are a couple of areas that are actually slightly different for containers in terms of security. First is the surface of attack. A container bundles binaries and libraries as part of the container image, so you don't need as much in the host image. If you're using containers as intended, this host OS should be really small, really minimal, doesn't have as much bloat, which then reduces the surface of attack. Next, resource isolation. This is built into containers, allowing you to easily allocate resources like storage volumes to certain processes using namespaces. In terms of permissioning, containers have normal access controls as you'd expect for controlling access to shared resources. Containers also encourage the use of microservices, which enables fine-grained access control to those resources. On the flip side, containers are, by construction, much more powerful and have a wider range of syscalls that they can perform, which opens up a bigger attack surface to the host. Lastly, lifecycle. Containers enable fast development, but that also are frequently redeployed and are fairly short-lived, but that also offers the opportunity to have a more structured, automated software supply chain with compliance built in, and we'll talk about that in a second. At the same time, if an attacker ends up in your infrastructure, that container might be gone before you have a chance to actually investigate and do forensics on what's going on. So that's kind of scary.
All right, now we'll talk about a traditional software supply chain before we talk about how containers change that. So if you're working in IT in a large traditional enterprise today, you might not have even heard of a software supply chain. A software supply chain is not how you get your finance team to fulfill the invoice and do procurement for the software you need. And it's not how you prevent unwanted hardware from being in your data center, how a Bloomberg. That's a hardware supply chain. A software supply chain is anything you depend on for your software. It's all of your binaries, all of the source code used to build those, all of the open source packages your dependency manager pulls in, and that code your vendor's vendor wrote. It's even that Kubernetes dashboard you forgot was running and left exposed. It's all of your software and how it got there. So traditional patch management in a large enterprise today looks like this. You've got a couple steps. The first step is to get the patch. This is going to come from a variety of places. It might come from a software distributor you pay. It might come from a mailing list on some open source project, or it might come from a vendor patch feed that you paid for. To keep it exciting, sometimes this patch isn't even sent to the dev team. Sometimes it's sent to whoever purchased the software. So you have to chase this down across your organization. Next, you have to apply that patch and figure out how to. First, you probably want to do this on a test server since you don't have a test environment. So you pick a workload that isn't too critical and apply the patch there and see if it still looks like it's working. If it does work, then you apply the patch everywhere else, at least everywhere that you can think of. You want to start with that spreadsheet that somebody filled out a couple weeks ago and probably hasn't updated since then of all the services running in production. After that works, you pick a couple more servers at random and just keep applying the patch until you think you found everything. But reality is that in a couple of years from now, you're probably still going to find things that aren't patched that the cryptocurrency miners have been running on.
So what's wrong with this setup? Well, first of all, it's a pain to maintain. You might have an asset inventory, which lists all of the hardware you have and the version of software that you think it's running. And even if you're using a tool for this, it's basically a spreadsheet, right? There's a lot of manual checking, and each time you patch, you have to go manually update that tool. You can't dynamically create this easily, which is annoying. When you do patch, you take your servers down. This is some poor soul up at 2 a.m. on Sunday who has to manually go hook a cable into every single server and apply an update. A friend of mine was telling me a story, and being in a Bay Area tech company less than 5 years ago, of realizing at 10 p.m. that his update was failing, and both not having enough caffeine and not having enough deodorant to quite make it through to the morning to actually get that out there. So that's a pretty terrible situation, and I'm sure it's very relatable. When there's a new ODay vulnerability, you have to quickly apply a patch, and that's also kind of terrifying. Even something like Spectre Meltdown, most large corporations were unable to patch before their next regular patch cycle, if they were even lucky to get into that patch cycle, leaving them exposed to potential attacks. But lastly, the number one question that always ends up getting asked is, am I affected? Do I have something somewhere in my infra running with that unpatched vuln? After all, that's the first question that your CISO is going to end up asking you. And so what does an ideal software supply chain look like? Well, running containerized microservices leads to a different security model for VMs. That's the argument that we're trying to make. You have to adopt a fundamentally different mindset, which we'd argue actually leads to better security long term. Containers are short-lived, immutable, and frequently redeployed, which leads to a few nice properties. First, containers give you a software supply chain. Because containers are frequently redeployed, you can easily see what ends up in your infrastructure, and you have an enforcement point to control what should actually be there. Containers let you patch continuously and automatically. Rather than pushing a single line of code change, you rebuild and redeploy the whole image. If you have other processes that can take place passively, like patching your OS, you can be constantly doing these and rolling them out as part of your normal rollout process. Lastly, containers mean you can actually tell if you're affected by a new vulnerability. Since containers are immutable, you're not changing single lines of code, you're changing whole containers. You can look at what you deployed and see if the vuln is there. It also means that if something does change in production, when you didn't expect it to, that's a built-in alarm that something went wrong. So let's dig a bit more into each of these one by one.
All right, so now we'll talk about the supply chain that containers give you. Specifically, what's different about them compared to before you use containers. Well, historically, with a monolithic application running on a virtual or physical machine, when you want to make a change, your developers would SSH into that machine or use some tool that basically does the same thing as SSHing in. They're going to make those code changes or infrastructure changes without really knowing what's going to happen or without keeping track of what changes have been made by other people. There are manual adjustments, other developers made other changes, including things like VMs restarting and patches being applied automatically. You might not even know exactly what's running on your VM at this point, because everyone's just changing things on the fly. This is not only hard to debug, but there's very little formal process around it. Next time you have to do another one of these, you'll just SSH into the VM again and hope that the same patch gets applied. This isn't a great security story, and it's really difficult on your ops team. They don't really know what's running anymore. Your infrastructure is coupled to the code running on it and all of the changes that were made to lead it to that point. And when you have systems or people touching this all day long, you have what's known as mutable infrastructure, which is pretty brittle. It is technically possible to achieve the opposite of this, immutable infrastructure, without moving to containers, but it's difficult. Containers were basically designed from the ground up with immutable infrastructure in mind. Containers define a standard pipeline from code to node based on the ideas of immutable infrastructure. You can write your code and ensure it meets your desired standards for build, testing, signing, and deployments, and then deploy it as an entire unit inside of that one container. Microservices get redeployed as individual containers or sets of individual containers rather than changing specific lines of code and rebuilding binaries on a host directly. This is easier to debug, easier to maintain, and easier to change.
It's easier to change than a bad perm from the 80s.
So with this defined pipeline, there are a few different pieces to consider. When you start building a container, you start at the top level, usually the from line and a Docker file, sometimes referred to as your base image. This is usually some kind of Linux OS distribution like Fedora or Debian or Ubuntu, plus some company-specific tweaks you've applied on top of that. Next comes your code, usually. This is the code used to build your binaries and all of the dependencies that your code needs, both language-level dependencies and then system-level dependencies. After all of that gets built, you have your application image. This is the final deliverable that you're going to be deploying to prod. Once that's ready to deploy, you can run all of your tests on it, make sure that it's correct, and then you can do the actual deployment of that container image all as one piece. You can also enforce policies at this deployment time that kind of vary between your different environments. You might be fine running something that hasn't been tested in QA because that's where you're going to be doing the testing, but you want to block that from running in production. Altogether, all of these components, the nouns and the verbs put together, make your software supply chain.
Next, that containers let you patch automatically and continuously easily. So I'm really trying to make patching sexy again, and that's because containers are sexy now, so obviously patching is going to be sexy again, right? Even today, many security attacks that occur in the wild against containers are drive-by attacks. Attackers looking for deployments with known vulns that they can exploit. And those vulnerabilities are rarely 0 days, right? They're things that have been around for years left unpatched. Like wearing sunscreen, scanning for vulnerabilities and patching them is like one of those boring practices you should really be doing. But patching containers is different than patching VMs. Containers are meant to be immutable, remember? So you, as Dan just said, so you rebuild and redeploy the whole image when you need to change something. This happens very often as containers are short-lived. Sysdig estimates that 95% of containers live for less than a week. But wait, that's really often. If you look at traditional patch management, Patch Tuesday comes once a month. You might have some additional patches that you have to apply weekly, and you might even have a regular maintenance window to actually apply those patches. But there's not enough time in the day or Club Mate in the world to deal with deployments that only live for a week. It's just not worth your time.
There's a Club Mate fan back there, I saw.
So going back to our patch management process, what's different with containers? First, with containers, you don't patch live containers. You patch the images that are in your container registry. You can easily see everything that has the old unpatched software and apply the patch everywhere at once, and also remove stuff that you don't want anymore from that registry and not allow it into your environment. Then you can roll out the new images. The fully patched container can be rolled out or rolled back as one unit, so the patch rollout process becomes the same as your hopefully very frequent code rollout process, complete with monitoring, canarying, and testing. So I guess it's maybe okay if you're still running out as 1% test to prod as your test. Your patch rolls out using the normal process and in a predictable way. Once you've rolled out a newly patched container and tested that everything works as expected, then you can move over actual workload traffic. This means you can patch your application without having any downtime. And to iterate one of the points I was just making, that the patch rollout process becomes the same as your code rollout process, this is really critical. It means you can deploy things gradually with your entire testing suite and roll back as needed. Patching is no longer this ad hoc thing you have to manage. This will certainly make your SREs happy. This is in line with one of the key SRE principles that you have progressive rollouts. Non-emergency rollouts must proceed in phases, and it's specific to your workload and environment that'll determine what % you want to enable at each stage, how long you spend at each stage, et cetera, before you're comfortable with moving to the next stage. Your team can supervise these rollouts to ensure that nothing unexpected happens, and then adjust accordingly. An alternative, although it's less preferable because it happens on that ad hoc basis, is to let the rollout happen unpredictably ad hoc when containers die. So if you have a patched image in your registry, next time the container dies, Kubernetes will spin up another container to compensate, and any patches that you've applied to that will naturally roll out to your infrastructure. Depending on the lifespan of your containers, that could actually be patched in a matter of days. Even though it's tempting to roll out a patch for an O day as quickly as possible, that's not always the best decision, especially if you know that it's not yet being exploited in your infrastructure.
Nobody wants to have to make the choice between downtime and being vulnerable to something, but trust me, it's way better than not having the chance to make that choice.
Agreed. So in some sense, taking all this together, it means that patching is dead, right? Patching doesn't matter. As long as you're killing your containers on a regular basis, your software will always be up to date. That's a huge security improvement. And that's what I mean when I say that containers can actually be better for security and how you manage patching in your environment. This is the takeaway. So you're scanning your images and finding a ton of vulnerabilities. Now what? Practically, how do you address all of these? There's 3 main things that you can do to actually deal with that. The first category is patching, what we've been talking about. This is something you should be doing on a regular basis through your Docker build files. It's what we've been talking about, add apt-get update and apt-get upgrade to apply patches to your images. The second category is removing packages that you don't need. A stock Debian or Ubuntu system comes with many packages, and in many cases, you won't actually need all of them to run your application. Having those additional packages on your system creates a larger attack surface unnecessarily. Again, it's not that minimal thing that we were talking about earlier. So you should analyze what you really need, and if there are the packages that you can be removed, then remove them.
You don't want to collect operating system packages like you did with POGs.
The third category is moving to a smaller distribution like Alpine or Debian Slim. You could run your application using one of those smaller distributions to have a smaller surface of attack again. Another option here are also distroless images.
All right, one more quick poll. How many people here are responsible for some form of production infrastructure today? Quite a few people. All right, great. So this is a safe space. I'm not going to tell your boss, but put your hand down. Okay, so I'm going to give you 1 day, and you have to give me a list of every service running in production and all of its dependencies. Keep your hand up if you can do that. One person, three people. Okay. This is going to get even harder. What if you needed every service and the exact revision of source code used to build each of those dependencies?
Oh, good. I was going to call you liars. Oh.
This is a pretty honest audience. Great. All right. So what if you only had 1 hour to get that information?
Nice.
That's awesome. You must be using Kubernetes. All right. So this is the real power of containers for security. Containers are immutable and content addressable. So they're stored in such a way that they're addressed by the contents inside of it, which can't change. This means you actually know what's running in your environment. For example, which images are deployed. Knowing what you have deployed in your environment is one of the biggest pain points of traditional patching. You couldn't even tell if you were affected by the patch. Here, everything lives in a single registry, so it's just a quick check to see what's running and what's inside of each image inside of that registry. So what does this mean from a security point of view? It means you have a full manifest of everything running on every production system you can check. This is called your container registry. It contains every image you ever built, including everything inside of it, just waiting for you to inspect. So to figure out what's in prod, you've got a couple steps here. Here's how it looks in practice. First, your container environment, usually Kubernetes or something else, can trivially provide a list of all the containers running. This is just a few lines of bash and kube control. From there, you can inspect the contents of every one of those containers from looking at them inside of your registry. Once you know what's in those packages, you can cross-reference those with one of the many excellent CVE databases out there. There are a few gotchas in this process. First of all, you want to make sure you're working with the digest form of container addresses. This is the immutable version we talked about before. You also need to make sure you're leaving yourself enough breadcrumbs to work your way all the way back from your build process. If you're compiling source into a binary on an untrusted developer's machine that might have been compromised, the fact that you know where all the source code came from doesn't really get you much.
Awesome. Time for a demo. So we're going to actually do 2 demos simultaneously. One involving physical patching and one involving computer patching. We're going to put the iron back in environment.
Ready?
Yeah. It's a race a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I've got this GitHub app here I set up. It is running in Kubernetes, and it is vulnerable to the shell shock vulnerability from 2014, if anybody remembers that one.
I have an iron and an ironing board.
Yeah, so this is a modern application, so it's got a Docker file and a whole bunch of Kubernetes YAML. I've got it running here inside of Kubernetes. It is a cloud-native web page. It uses something called the Cloud Native Gateway Interface, or CGI. We can take a look at that in action here. We can click submit.
My iron is plugged in.
So this application is running in Kubernetes. It just tells us a little basic information about what it's running in and then which version of bash we're using. This is a pretty old one.
I have a jean jacket that has a hole, I think, maybe. Has a hole in the arm.
So this is based off of an excellent GitHub repo I found that makes checking if something is vulnerable to shell shock and exploiting it pretty trivial. So this is the script we're going to use here, and we're going to take a look here at this application. See my terminal?
I need iron-on strips, so I need to open this.
Awesome. So we should have just defaced my web page.
It's terrifying. I haven't done this demo before.
Yeah, this is pure remote code execution. So we know we're affected by this now. We're going to go in and patch it. Pull up my editor, open up my Docker file, and remove this line here that's installing a super old version of bash on purpose. This was actually the hardest part to set up in this demo.
In case anyone was doubting, my iron is actually steaming.
I can hear it. It's a little
Brilliant.
scary.
I don't know if this is even, I didn't really think through this patching piece. Okay, we'll just figure it out. Okay. I have a patch. It's a Kubernetes patch. It's actually a sticker, so it's probably not going to stay on the jacket, but we're going to find out. And millennials who've never ironed before, you're going to want to put a piece of cloth on top of that. Just FYI. I'm now ironing.
I just built the new image. I'm going to push it up to my registry. Hopefully the conference Wi-Fi works as well as the conference electricity.
Yeah, this iron's hot.
Awesome. So now I'm going to come into my YAML file and change this to reference the new version of the code. we are going to apply that.
I think this is on. I'm going to turn this off. I didn't actually think I was going to beat you. I thought you were going to beat me.
I think it's a tie. Yay, we're fixed. And we are on a modern version of Bash. All right, clap for the ironing.
For the real demo also. So now it's actually critical, which is I have this patched jean jacket, but you're wearing one that has a hole.
Exactly.
So how are we going to get that on you? This one's green. This is critical in a second. One arm at a time. Okay. We're patched. All right. So you get the idea, and now let's iron out the details of what actually happens in practice.
So you might not have realized it, but you just saw us do a blue-green deployment with physical jackets. I took a few shortcuts in the demo, but so if you haven't seen one of those before, I know we didn't explain it ahead of time. A blue-green deployment is a way to manage your workloads so that you can roll out a change to production without affecting traffic. I was able to get this jacket on before I took that one off completely. So the way it works is you're currently running a blue workload in production, and you want to deploy a new green workload. For the security team, the new green workload is your patched version. Right now, you already have blue running, taking all of your traffic, and you find out that there's a new ODay vulnerability. So you attain that patch, you roll out a parallel green deployment in production, and then since you don't have a test environment, you just send some traffic over to that gradually. Once you're confident it's working, you move more and more traffic over, and once everything is great, you can kill the blue workload. So using blue-green deployments means that you can patch security in production live. This means you can move the container from one truck to another while they're both going at full speed. It's like that terrible scene in Matrix Reloaded. So now this hasn't been specific to containers. You can even do it with jackets. So why do containers make this different? They make deploying these changes more frequent and more straightforward, which is how you're meant to do rollouts with containers. So Google's infrastructure is containerized based on our Borg orchestration system. It was the predecessor for Kubernetes. And we use it to deploy services and security patches on upwards of 4 billion containers a week. Borg runs a lot of key services at Google, including Google Compute Engine and Google Kubernetes Engine. That's right, we run containers in containers. Starting sometime in 2013, we realized we didn't want to have to deal with downtime for maintenance. Many of these maintenance events are disruptive. They require us to reboot the host machines. Our goal was to keep hardware and software updated across all of our data centers without having these restarts. So we use something called live migration, which is basically a blue-green deployment for running VMs. When a new workload is deployed alongside the existing workload, we use a load balancer to gradually move traffic over until it's fully handled by the new instance. If you're confused how we can do this for running VMs, remember again that VMs are run inside of containers in Borg. There are 3 basic stages in this live migration. In the first one, the VM is still executing on the source, while most state is sent from the source to the target. After that, there's a very brief blackout period in the middle where we stop everything and move the primary execution point over to the target. At the very end, we have a post-migration brownout period where the original source is still providing some services for the new target until migration is fully completed.
And specifically, this is what means that Google's infrastructure, including Google Cloud, were patched against Heartbleed in 2014 and Spectre and Meltdown in 2018 with no downtime to our VMs and users not noticing. Google was also involved in the incident response for these vulnerabilities, so had pre-release access to the patches. And even if you're not a large tech company with access to the patches ahead of time, though, containers mean that you can still start patching as soon as you know, even if you're pressed for time, and avoid having to panic or take down workloads in order to start securing them. So altogether, takeaways from today, that means that with a switch to containerized microservices and a DevOps-like frequent deployment model, you can apply security changes more often. You can enforce the software supply chain to control what's in your infrastructure and easily determine if you're affected by a new vulnerability. And with blue-green deployments, like Google does with live migration, you can patch your workloads live. And yes, containers can be more secure. They have the potential to do that since they approve your patching model. Containers, patched. To learn more, check out the blog post that Dan and I wrote. That's the first link on exactly this topic. And then there's also a link there to more information on container security. And if we have time, we'll look at the slide over questions. No time. So my last plug will just be, if you're at RSA and board, come check out this space where we're giving additional talks on container security and other security things. Awesome.